Okay. It is. We are into our second unit now, and we have these two readings that I've assigned. Gene Twenge, Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation, and Nausicaa Renner's How Social Media Shapes Our Identity. And just like last time, we're going to be looking at these two articles in relation to each other, and then trying to, one, answer some quiz questions about the articles, and also then write an essay. So, do you want to watch this discussion first, where I'm going to go through some points about the readings, and then I'll have some quiz materials put up on the Canvas page for you to crack out. Now, you guys have been doing really well on the quizzes, so those grades have been high, and that's good to see. We'll the grades for the first essay should be rolling in soon as well. Things are rolling along a little bit slower than perhaps is normal, but we're just going to keep plugging at it. Okay, so the obvious thing that these two readings share is that they deal with how technology is affecting today's younger generations in particular, but really everybody in a sense. And that's not unrelated to the first unit where we talked about Tafichi and Nagel, who also were dealing with the impact of the social media technologies on culture. This one's more about how the individual is shaped by it, and although they are very similar in how they address, they're sort of very similar in the subject matter they address, they have very different approaches. So let's think about Twenge first. Have smartphones destroyed a generation? In reading this article, and if you haven't read it yet, stop watching the video. I recommend stop watching the video and go and read it. Read it before you watch the video. Twenge's approach is very sort of social scientist, right? She's got her statistics and her graphs, and she's interviewed people, and she's got all this sort of data-driven approach. And whereas Nausicaa Renner, her approach is more sort of academic and philosophical, more theoretical, right? She's got a lot of sort of highfalutin ideas. There's less data. There's not any graphs or anything like that. But so they're approaching the subject matter from a different perspective. Nausicaa Renner is a sort of psychoanalytic theorist, right? So that's why you see fewer numbers here and more sort of academic prose, right? Trying to explain things from from a theoretical, almost philosophical perspective. Renner is the exact opposite, right? Renner is very, very concrete, and she tries to take a data-driven approach. And so, for instance, you get, the graphs that are embedded in the article, and you also get a lot of numbers thrown at you. And that makes this article pretty easy to follow on a base level, but also, open to certain kinds of criticisms about the nature of correlation and causation and things like that. And I'll get to that in a minute. Where's that word cliffs? Okay. So one passage I always sort of zoom in on, right? This is on page 1. She's talking about trends that she's noticed in teenage behavior. And she says, around 2012, I noticed abrupt shifts in teens' behaviors and emotional states. It's right here. Sorry, I should highlight. The gentle slopes of the line graphs became steep mountains and sheer cliffs. And many of the distinctive characteristics of the millennial generation began to disappear. And all my analyses of generational data, some reaching back to the 1930s, I had never seen anything like it. So when she talks about steep mountains and sheer cliffs, I'm sure you sort of understand what she's talking about here. She's talking about the actual lines on her graph. So what she says in the previous paragraph is that generational changes tend to be gradual and subtle, right? You don't overnight see a dramatic shift in behavior between, say, baby boomers and Gen Xers, right? But when it comes to the emergent generation, really she's talking about your generation, right? Although maybe even a little bit older than you, people who were teenagers in 2012. So you guys would have been more sort of young. Most of you, if you're 18, 19, would have been sort of preteen, but whatever. It's close enough, right? Dramatic shifts in teen behavior and emotional states. So those gentle slopes become sheer cliffs. In other words, dramatic changes in behavior. And you can see this visualized in the actual graphs, right? To a certain extent, anyway. Why is it so laggy? One of my screencasters on the browser's really laggy. Oh, here we go. So here are those sort of steep cliffs she's talking about, right? Driving less, dating less, not hanging out with friends as much. That top one may be the most dramatic. So her overall point is that as a generational scholar, because there is such a thing, she's used to seeing gradual changes, but now she's seeing sudden dramatic changes. And of course, she notices a correlation between the beginning of, this is a key figure for her, the beginning of those dramatic shifts and when sort of penetration of the smartphone into the market surpassed 50%. It's right here. What happened in 2012, this is page 2, to cause such dramatic shifts in behavior? It was after the Great Recession, blah, 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 which officially lasted, okay. But it was exactly the moment when the proportion of Americans who owned a smartphone surpassed 50%. But I do want to point out one thing, right? What she's noticing here is a correlation between the number of Americans who have a smartphone and these dramatic changes in teenage adolescent behavior that she sees. A correlation. A correlation means one thing happens and another thing happens at the same time, right? But a correlation is not necessarily the same thing as a causal relationship. And the old saying in statistics is correlation does not equal causation, right? That just because the two things are happening at the same time doesn't mean one is causing the other. You can theorize that it is. You can argue that it is, but it's not always evidently true. So I just wanted to point that out, that Twenge makes a lot of the correlation between smartphone use and these changes in behavior that she sees. But it's much harder to say with certainty that there's a causal relationship between these things. In other words, that smartphones are causing this behavior. And one thing that occurs to me even is that, for instance, she says she talks about depression, for instance. Now, what Twenge says is, this is page 2, rates of teen depression. Oh, wait, no, I want to find where she gets into more of the detail on this. Okay, so lots of things are on the rise. So is depression. This is page 6. So is depression. Once again, the effect of screen activities is unmistakable. The more time teens spend looking at screens, the more likely they are to report symptoms of depression. Okay. I'm pretty convinced. But I would also point out that people who are depressed, one other way of looking at this is that people who are depressed look at their screens more, right? Sort of escape into the digital world more. So you could at least make the argument that there's a kind of chicken and egg problem here where, okay, are the screens causing depression or are the screens like kind of treating the depression, right? Are they, so if there's a correlation, yes. Is there a correlation? Yes. Is that correlation causal in the direction of smartphones causing depression? Harder to say. And I'm not saying Twenge's article is bad or anything, but what I'm doing is saying that, when social scientists, sociologists start with the statistical correlations, you can't always take it at face value that means that A is causing B, right? Just because A and B are happening together. Maybe B is causing A. In any case, so we have all these sort of changes in teen behavior that she talks about, right? Teens are dating less, they're having less sex, they're some of the things are good, right? They're drinking and driving less because they're going out less, but they're hanging out with their friends less in person. And her, since you guys are the experts on this, I don't know if we were in a class right now and having a discussion, I would want to know, what do you think of this, right? Does this mirror what you see? And sometimes it's hard to answer a question like that when you're inside of it, right? Well, the way you behave is normal to you, but does the kinds of behaviors she described sound correct to you? You would know that better than I would, as an old man. I don't. I'm not an expert in how teens behave. I don't have it. My son is only 7, so. But that might be something that where you would think you would give some thought to, right? How much credence do I put in Twenge's article when what she's describing about behavior doesn't really match my own experience, or maybe it does match your experience? What I in previous semesters when I've taught this article, I always ask, how many of you have driver's licenses? And most people still have driver's licenses, but there are sometimes students who don't, and so there. Remember, she's talking about a decline, right? Not that nobody gets a driver's license anymore, or nobody has illicit sex anymore, or nobody hangs out with their friends anymore. Just that there's been a decline. So in a small sample size, it could be hard to figure out, well, does our experience support that or not? What are the categories she talks about, right? Driving less, working less, all things that sort of symbolize independence and breaking away from one's family unit a little bit more, right? Doing things you're not supposed to do, like drinking and taking drugs, are on the decline. and teenagers are spending more time at home. Of course, this is a pre-pandemic reading, so we're all spending more time at home now, right? Whatever she's describing in this article. Actually, it's funny. Twenge wrote an article, I think, in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. I'd have to look it up. Twenge just published an article a couple days ago about how the pandemic has been good for teenagers because they're using social media less and spending more time with their families. Seems to fly in the face a little bit of what she's saying here. I don't know, but she does. It was curious that came out. And if the class were more adaptable and less rigid in this online format, maybe we could read it, but we can't. Anyway, she talks about this this picture, right, on page 3 of the 1970s era roller rink, and this always makes me laugh because I'm not that old, but I am old enough to remember roller rinks, and I'm not sure if any of y'all are. I don't know if any still exist at all. When I was a little kid, we still had a roller rink up in the Wayne area in New Jersey where I grew up, and I remember it well. But she's talking about here the 1970s. I wasn't born yet, but she describes this kind of free-for-all, right, where the teenagers would get together, hang out, and there were no parents around, right? In the early 1970s, the photographer Bill Yates, this is page 30, shot a series of portraits at the Sweetheart roller skating rink in Tampa, Florida. In one, a shirtless teen stands with a large bottle of peppermint schnapps stuck in the waistband of his jeans. In another, a boy who looks no older than 12 poses with a cigarette in his mouth. The rink was a place where kids could get away from their parents and inhabit a world of their own. I don't know. Sorry about that. A world where they could drink, smoke, and make out in the backs of their cars. In stark black and white, the adolescent boomers gaze at Yates's camera with the self-confidence born of making your own choices, even if, perhaps especially if, your parents wouldn't think they were the right ones. So she's kind of romanticizing this older sort of early Gen X, early 70s teenagers. I mean, we're talking about like late boomers. I don't know. The terms, boomer, greatest generation, boomer, Gen X, millennial, they're kind of arbitrary and meaningless. I'm never really sure what I fall into. I was born in 1980, which by some estimates, some charts makes me a Gen Xer, so by some makes me a millennial. So I kind of straddle the line. But in any case, so these 1970s teenagers and adolescents, that they got away from their parents and they did things they weren't supposed to do. So the teenager drinking peppermint schnapps, like, that's a bad thing, right? The 12-year-old smoking a cigarette, those are bad things, right? We don't want kids doing that. And yet Twenge here is sort of saying, well, this is what teenagers used to be like. This is what adolescents used to be like. And we see less and less of this. And there's an aspect of this, okay, that may be bad. Teenagers drinking, teenagers smoking, teenagers making out. I don't know if that's bad. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But you know what I mean. 15 years. But the allure of independent, but the good thing about it is that they're independent. They're making their own choices. Their parents aren't involved. And they're kind of experimenting with the boundaries of social propriety in a way that's healthy. Now, of course, she says, the allure of independence, so powerful to previous generations, holds less sway over today's teens, who are less likely to leave the house without their parents. The shift is stunning. 12th graders in 2015 were going out less often than 8th graders did as recently as 2009. And less likely to date and all that, etc. So this image of the teenagers, and I don't know why. I think in the original article, the actually had some of the pictures. They're not reproduced here, right? But on the one hand, you're like, well, okay, great. We don't want teenagers drinking peppermint schnapps at the roller rink. I don't want anybody drinking peppermint schnapps, as far as I'm concerned. But yet, why is this good, right? Why is Twenge sort of holding this up as something that's been lost? And that kind of segues into something that Renner talks about. So let's flip over to Renner for a second. Where is so again, Renner is the kind of psychoanalytical, theoretical approach to this issue, how social media shapes our identity. And Renner talks about this thing called the moratorium, right? This is on what page of Renner? 3, on page 3 of Renner. So one of the things that Renner talks about a lot is how the internet and social media takes things that used to be sort of ephemeral and makes them kind of concrete and permanent. You do something embarrassing, something happens, it ends up on social media, you post it when you're young, not realizing that later you'll be embarrassed by it, and then it's kind of there forever. Even if you try to delete it, it's there forever in some form. And so that teenagers today have lost, in some respects, the forgiving nature of the old world, where you did things when you were young and then nobody remembered them and they weren't preserved in perpetuity, right? When I was in college, there was no social media. We had like message boards and chat rooms and primitive things like that, but nothing that kind of took your embarrassing episodes or your I don't know, things you'd rather forget about and enshrine them forever, or left evidence of them, right? You guys have to be more careful, right? You never know when something that you post on social media or something that you do will end up on social media, or you'll post it yourself on social media, will come back to haunt you. And I'm sure they've told you, somebody's told you, like, be very careful about this, because when you apply for jobs these days, employers go through your social media, right, to make sure they don't want people who've been doing keg stands every weekend or whatever. I don't know. Nevertheless, it's not something that people in previous generations ever had to worry about. We all did stupid things when we were kids and teenagers, some more stupid than others. But, we graduated college, we went out into the world, and that stuff got left behind in a way that may not be the case for you, where there will be more of a digital footprint, a digital evidence of whatever it was you were doing when you were 17, 18, 19. And what it says, she quotes this theorist Eichhorn. Everyone, this one's bad at highlighting, but it's right here. Everyone, Eichhorn writes, benefits from experimentation in adolescence, right? A time when we can F around. I'm going to try to keep it clean in these videos. Right? I curse more in class, but same thing, right? These videos are evidence. I don't want the dean to know how much I'm cursing. Actually, I don't care. Tell the dean how much I'm cursing. During that time, hang on. My wife is messaging me. What does she want? I forget it. I'll do that later. I'm only checking because something important is happening. I'll edit this out later, or I'll forget to. Nah, whatever. She lost the dog. Everyone, Eichhorn writes, benefits from experimentation in adolescence. During that time, we exist in what the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson called a psychosocial moratorium. And this is the term, the moratorium. What is the moratorium, this psychoanalytical term? Remember, Renner, theoretical, philosophical, psychoanalytic. Twenge, social scientist, data-driven, facts and figures, graphs, right? Very different approach. The moratorium is a stage in which we hover between the morality learned by the child and the ethics to be developed by the adult. The moratorium is a period of trial and error that society allows adolescents who are permitted to take risks without fear of consequence, in hopes that doing so will clarify a, quote, core self, a personal sense of what gives life meaning. So, according to this theory, we're sort of entitled to a period in our adolescence where we can experiment and test the boundaries of our ethical norms and do bad things and transgress, and that's part of shaping ourself. How does this relate back to Twenge, right? This is something that will be on the quiz. This is a freebie here, right? How does this relate back to Twenge? Well, what did Twenge give as an example of a kind of moratorium, right? A free place to screw around and mess up. It would be that roller rink, right? Okay, so they're doing bad things. They're doing things we don't want kids and teenagers to do, but it's socially acceptable because it's the time in life where you get to do that kind of screwing around. A stage in which we hover between the morality. The moratorium is a period of trial and error that society allows adolescents who are permitted to take risks without fear of consequence, etc. Now, she goes on. The internet interrupts the privacy of this era. It tends to scale up mistakes to monumental proportions and to put them on our permanent records. Colleges and employers now look at social media accounts for evidence of character. Eichhorn spends less time than she might have on how this affects today's teens. What is it like to live under threat? That's a question about you guys. What are the ramifications when an entire generation never gets the chance to experiment freely or to remake themselves? And part of this is because, right? So you guys have this looming threat of how social media kind of dangles over your head. You can get publicly shamed. You can get cyberbullied. You could even end up on the local news, for doing something stupid. Things that would rarely happen in the 90s. And as Renner points out, as Twenge points out, part of this is because your generation, and not just your generation anymore, but you guys are sort of the pioneers of this. Where did it go? Where's my document relentlessly? Come on. Where'd you go? Okay. So she talks about how teenagers today sometimes feel distressed by, I guess, what we call FOMO, right? Fear of missing out or of being left out, because everybody's social media account is sort of constantly projecting at you how fun and exciting everybody else's life is, right? This is page 7. Page 7. What's the connection between smartphones and the apparent psychological distress? Right here. What's the connection between smartphones and the apparent psychological distress this generation is experiencing? For all their power to link kids day and night, social media also exacerbates the age-old teen concern about being left out. Again, in the 90s, you didn't necessarily know if you were missing out on something fun someone else is doing. Or your other friends got together and did something without you. Maybe you'd find out about it, maybe you wouldn't. But today it's like Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, Facebook. You're going to find out. It's going to be broadcast at you. Today's teens may go to fewer parties and spend less time together in person, but when they do congregate, because of this, right, they document their hangouts relentlessly. In other words, teenagers today, and I got news for you, it's not just teenagers, right? It's adults too, are documenting, in other words, broadcasting, advertising, announcing, recording, preserving every moment of their social lives. They document their hangouts relentlessly on Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook. This article is pre-TikTok. But that's really more for humor, right? Dancing. I don't know. I don't get TikTok. You start to feel old when the point of the platform starts to elude you. So it started with Snapchat. I didn't get Snapchat. Now I don't really get TikTok either. But I turned 40 a month ago, so probably explains why. Those not invited to come along are keenly aware of it. Accordingly, the number of teens who feel left out has reached all-time highs across age groups. Like the increase in loneliness, the upswing in feeling left out has been swift and significant. So, two things going on here. One, all this broadcasting of our social lives is having an impact on us psychologically, because we're constantly consuming the exciting stuff that other people are doing, and it makes us sometimes feel left out or bad, right? And not just like the parties or whatever, but, you know, someone posts on social media that they got accepted to Princeton and you got accepted to Rutgers, and makes you feel bad, or, you know, right? I mean, it can have, you know, screw Princeton, but you get what I'm saying, right? Other people's good fortune constantly being broadcast and constantly consuming it can have this effect of making us sometimes feel not as good about our own lives. People having fun and broadcasting that fun can have a negative psychological effect on us because we feel left out, or like we weren't invited to be part of it, or like our lives aren't as cool or whatever. At the same time, all this documentation goes back to Renner's point about how we've lost the freedom to kind of screw up because everything's documented. And even if it's not you doing the documenting, your friend could post it on social media, even if you don't necessarily have control over it, right? Which is another thing that Renner talks about. So these two articles work together in very interesting ways. They're not redundant. They don't cover exactly the same ground, and yet they speak to each other meaningfully, and they kind of fill in the gaps for each other. One, again, we have these two different approaches, and you can see the kind of resonance between them. So the quiz questions some will focus on Renner, some will focus on Twenge, and some of them will focus on these connections, and especially the kinds of things we're talking about, right? Things that I've talked about in this video discussion will find their way precisely onto the quiz. I promise you that. Not all the questions, right, will be drawn from this, but some of the questions will be drawn directly from it. So anyway, I'm going to leave it here because I've been told many times, don't make these video discussions too long. People don't listen to them. If they're longer than, you can't go an hour. Nobody's going to watch the professor, head in a square talking for an hour. But having watched this, look for the quiz. I haven't decided. I'm either going to do two separate documents, one for Twenge, one for Renner, and give you two different due dates, or maybe I'll just do one combined quiz. Either way, it doesn't matter. And look for that material going up shortly. And I'll be grinding away at the SA1 grades and try to get those back to you. I have to get them back before Folds review, which is next week sometime. All right. So thank you very much. Any problems, just reach out to me on Canvas, okay? And this is Professor Salerno signing out. If I can find a stop. Here it is. Bye.